this? Josh, is this going to ruin the... I'm just reading the thing. Is that okay? I'll put the mic on. Yeah, I'll put the mic on. Get myself set up for a second. Talk amongst yourselves. Find a friend. Okay. Is that my phone, did you say? No, I've got my phone here. Okay. Glory be. Ooh. Oh no. Okay. That's a problem. Let's get my notes up on here. Okay, no, it's fine. Okay, good morning, guys. I'm just going to give you a few bits of family news, a few announcements and updates. For those who are part of Table Family, we're going to try putting most of these up on the church app. So please make sure that, first of all, you've downloaded the church app, and second of all, that you check in on there because this information will be on there. First things first, giving. I hope the giving slide will come up in a minute, but we love talking about money, because how we use our money is an outworking of the faith that we have and the reality of our conviction that God is our provider. And so there's a few different ways you can give in this church. The easiest way is either through the app or text the number up there, and you can give however much. But if you do prefer to give by check, by the way, you are able to do that. Just speak to me about it and we can help facilitate that. A few things that are really important for you to have in your calendars. So on the 18th of December, it's a Friday evening starting from 7:15 p.m., we are going to have a Table Family evening that's going to be a Christmas party. We're going to have Christmas movie, Christmas treats. There won't be dinner, so eat before you come. That evening is not going to be here. It's going to be in Back Bay area, 75 Arlington Street. The details of this will be up on the app, but I just wanted to put it out there again. I know Julian mentioned it last week. It's a family evening, so we're going to ask that you don't invite guests. We really just want to invest in time as a family, some quality time together. Friday 18th, 7:15 p.m. It will be in Back Bay. Check the app for details. Sunday, the 20th of December, is going to be our Christmas service. And note this, the time is different. It's not going to be at 10 a.m. as normal. It's going to be at 5 p.m. just to help us make it a little bit more festive. It's going to be a shorter meeting. It's going to be 5 to 6 p.m. And that one specifically, we are encouraging you to invite guests. It's going to be super guest friendly. We're working hard to make sure that that evening is just put on with real excellence. I'm going to preach a much shorter message than normal, and it is going to have an evangelistic edge to the message. So please invite however many guests you like. The digital invite is going to be again on the church app, so that you can send it to whoever you want to invite them to come along that evening. And then that's going to be our last meeting of the year. And the following 2 Sundays, we're going to have a break. So there will be no meeting on the 27th, no meeting on the 3rd. The first Sunday back after Christmas will be the 10th of January. And in those 2 weeks, we're going to have a complete break from all meetings. So no Wednesday community gatherings, no early morning prayer on Thursdays. So make sure you note that so that you don't turn up here. I mean, I'm sure you'd have a great time, but the rest of us won't be here. And just to say, at the end of today's meeting, Ash is going to be at the back of the hall. I know lots of us are already volunteering and serving in different roles, but I know that there's loads of people who've been added to the community and haven't had a chance to sign up to volunteer somewhere. I really want to encourage you. Volunteering is one of the main ways of finding community, finding a real sense of family, and it's just a really fun way to be involved in the community. So Ash will be at the back. If you're not volunteering in any area of service in the church but would like to, please go speak to her. She can give you all the details and information on that. I think that's me having covered everything. I'm not going to be using my iPad because the notes aren't going up, so forgive me as I will be reading tiny print for this message. So in our family, we love this time of year. When I say we, actually Julian surpasses all people in this regard. In about October, I start having conversations with him where he's saying, is it appropriate to play Christmas music in the house yet? I have very strict rules on that sort of thing. No, it is not appropriate in October. Yes, I'm legalistic about this. He has more festive ideas. When we put up our Christmas tree, we ended up putting it up earlier than I would normally like. 1st of December is when I normally go for it. But we put it up because Julian was super excited about it. We've got to have the festive stuff up. So if you come to our house, normally we don't do a lot of clutter. We're relatively minimalist in how we have things up. But Christmas time, there's a whole load of things. In fact, little known fact about Julian and I, one of our first dates was putting up his Christmas tree in England. And there were a lot of interesting decorations that year that have not resurfaced since we got married. But the point is, we really love this time of year, and we play Christmas music so much so that our beautiful children will ask us to stop. That's what it seems like in our house. So this last couple of weeks, listening to Christmas carols, festive music playing, and if you stop and listen to the lyrics of Christmas music, sometimes you realize that there's words being said or sung that we don't really analyze what they really mean. I know that's true for me. In fact, I find carols often really difficult to have in times of worship because they seem like really nice poetic language, but I find it hard to engage my heart and mind in the words that are being sung. And you know, one of the carols, which is probably my favorite to sing, but Joy to the World, people sing that the world over at Christmas time, whether believers or non-believers. What do those words actually mean? What does it mean that joy came to the world? Because I'm pretty sure that if you asked non-believers what they think about Christianity, what they think about God, what they think about Christians in general, I'm pretty convinced that joy wouldn't be top of their list of descriptors about God, Christians, or Christianity. And yet we sing this carol, Joy to the World, and we get it from Luke 2, and we're going to look at Luke 2 in a second. But part of my invitation for us during this Advent season is really to think about what do the songs that we sing this time of year, what do they really mean? And does my expression of Christianity and does my interaction with God express the songs in any form of reality, or are they just sweet lyrics that we sing that don't really translate in our everyday lives? But anyway, let's look at Luke 2 together, and we're going to think about all over the topic of joy this morning. Luke 2, verse 1. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all went to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. And while they were there, the time came for her to give birth. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling cloths, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. And in the same region, there were shepherds out in the field, keeping watch over their flocks by night. And an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were filled with great fear. And the angel said to them, "Fear not, for behold, I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all the people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. And this will be a sign for you. You will find a baby wrapped in swaddling cloths and lying in a manger." And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace among those with whom he is pleased." Or another translation would put, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace and goodwill among men." I love these verses partly because they are so beyond what would be normal reality for most human beings. If you read these verses and kind of detach faith from them for a second, they seem like fairy tale. A child is born, angels sing about his birth. So many people treat the nativity like a fairy tale. Non-Christians love the nativity because it's sweet and children dress up and it's just such a lovely story, and it is really akin to something like a Cinderella or a Sleeping Beauty, lovely stories that are far too fantastical to actually be true, except for the fact that this is true. The nativity is no fairy tale. This is historical fact, and I love it because Luke, the author of this gospel, he's a scientific mind. He's a doctor by trade, and so he writes the story with as many historical facts as he can fit in, because he's inviting the readers of his day to go and check it up. This is when he was the governor. This is when this was the emperor. This is what was happening in the time. This is when there was the census. The whole point is, go and check out these facts. I'm giving you the information because I want you to understand that what sounds like a fairy tale is no fairy tale at all, but you can actually check up these details. They actually happened. It's amazing. We're entering into Advent season, and I really want to hit home to us, whatever sounds like a sweet fairy tale is in fact historical fact, not fiction. And I love it because you get a sense of the heart of God towards humanity, and it might be different to what some would suppose. The words that I see here, joy, peace, and goodwill. Wow. Most people, that's not what they would be anticipating God has in mind when he thinks of humanity. I'm sure there would be loads of other words that people would think are how God's heart is posed towards humanity. But actually, the gospel writer here is really clear. The angels announce something from the heart of God towards human beings, and it's joy, peace, and goodwill. And over the next 3 weeks, those are the words that we're going to be looking at. Obviously, today I'm speaking on joy. Next week, Julian will be speaking on peace. And then for our guest service, I'll be speaking on goodwill. But if you want to know what God thinks about humanity, those are 3 good words to start with: joy, peace, and goodwill. And I love this joy because the first thing about it, I think, is that it's incredibly surprising. Like I said, if we go outside and we take a poll of people and we just say, hey, give me top 3 words that you think about that come to mind when you think God or Christianity, I'm willing to bet that joy would not be anywhere on any of those lists. Joy doesn't tend to be what people associate with Christians, which is an indictment against Christians, by the way. But it's not the word that people tend to associate with Christians. It's certainly not the word that people tend to associate with Christianity, and definitely not to do with God. It's funny because the angels announce, hey guys, God is moving into your neighborhood. That's essentially what they're saying. God is moving right next door to you, and because of that, they speak great joy. Now, for most of us, when an authoritative figure moves next door, it's not an invitation to turn up the music in our parties, but rather we start behaving ourselves that bit better. That's what we tend to think when an authoritative figure moves in. Well, if a police officer moved in next door to your house, or for example in our house, moved above or below us where you can hear all the things that are happening in all of the houses because the walls are paper thin, we wouldn't think, oh good, the police are here, so let's make sure our parties are even louder than before. Rather, we'd be controlling the amount of sound, really aware that there's someone in authority who's moved in and they can probably do something about the fact that I'm not behaving myself. Or I don't know if you're anything like me, but if I'm driving, minding my own business, having a lovely time, driving very safely, I might add, and a police car pulls in behind me, even if I was driving safely before, now I'm just completely paranoid. I'm like checking everything. It's as if I'm in a driving test all of a sudden, and they don't care. They're not actually even there for me. They're just doing their, on their normal drive. But because I'm aware that the police are near me, suddenly I feel I need to behave. That's essentially how most people view God. If someone was to say, God has moved in, most people wouldn't think, oh, I'm so glad, let's turn up the music. Most people think, ooh, I better behave myself. But what's really funny here and what's surprising about who God is that the angels don't say, hey, shepherds, just so you know, God is moving into the neighborhood, so you better learn how to behave now, which is what we would most assume would be the case if God moved in. Rather, they say, hey, shepherds, God has moved into your neighborhood, it's time to party. It gives us a completely unexpected lens of who God is. He's not a God who's saying primarily behave yourselves. He's a God who's saying primarily time to party, guys, here I am. The whole gospel, and we've not understood it if we don't get this, is meant to totally change our lens of what it means to know God and what God is like. Because the reality is the enemy, right from day one in the Garden of Eden, has been heavily invested in making us believe things that are not true about God. And one of the things that he does around that is to make us feel like he's a cold, distant headmaster who is waiting to strike you if you do things wrong, rather than showing us the reality of God, which is a father who is the kindest, funniest person who you want to introduce to your friends because he's that cool and that funny and you want to have in your parties because in fact he's the life and soul of every party he's in. But the enemy doesn't want us to know that. Because if we get too close to God, then we'll understand just how funny he is. So rather, the enemy is constantly telling us, no, better behave yourself. You actually don't want God to know what you're doing, because if he knows, you're going to be in trouble. So rather hold him at arm's length. Oh, you made a mistake. You better hold him at 2 arms length now, because if he comes too close, he's definitely going to have words about that thing you did. And so the enemy is constantly spinning a tale, just like he did with Adam and Eve in the garden, to skew our lens of the kindness of God. Because if you understood how fun and how happy he is, then you might actually want to be near him. And obviously the enemy's goal is to separate us from him as much as he can. Yeah. This is why I think it's an indictment against the church when Christians are not seen through the lens of joy, because it's our job to retell the story. Yeah. It's our job to tell humanity, listen, he's actually the best person that you want to have close. He's actually the kindest father. He's actually the one you want to tell when you've done something wrong. Because he's not a father who's going to say, well, you better fix it. He's going to say, how can I help? Let's both fix it together. He's that kind of father. He's the father you want to call if you're in jail and you get one phone call. Whereas the enemy is constantly telling us, if you get in trouble, you definitely don't want to call him. But that's a lie. And here we have the angels retelling the story. They're setting the record straight. They're saying, hey, listen up, humanity. God has moved into the neighborhood, and that is the best news you could possibly have. It's time to party. And so this is the first thing that I love about these verses. The joy of Christianity is, in fact, incredibly surprising. The second thing that I want to say about this is that the joy of Christianity is loud. People might say, oh, okay, I get it. So joy, God is a joy-filled God. Christians have joy. Excellent, I get it. I'm assuming that joy must be a respectable kind of joy, like a polite kind of joy, a very British kind of joy, you might say. I'm British, so I can say that. A joy that would be library proof, that a librarian would approve of, a kind of sweet little smile, a gulp clap, that kind of joy. That seems very reasonable for a God. That seems very reasonable for a religion. That seems that we can get our heads around. But we don't get that option. Because the angel doesn't say, I bring you good news of respectable joy. He says, I bring you good news of great joy. Now, the problem is when we get over familiar with words in the Bible, we stop reading them. We stop noticing them. So what's happened is we read, because we've heard it every Christmas time for our whole lives, good news of great joy. The word great no longer even registers. And the word joy just becomes a simple smile or a religious form of happiness that's actually sickly and not actually joy. We'll get to that in a second. But the angel says great joy, and that word great is actually loud. I bring you good news of loud joy. This is no library proof form of joy. This is loud, uncontrollable, definitely not sensible or respectable form of joy. This is joy that's so loud that people turn around and are like, who's laughing? What is going on? That's the kind of joy, and it originates with God. That's the kind of joy he has. It's not sweet, it's not sickly, and it's not polite. This is life and soul of the party. Someone turn the music up. God wants to dance kind of joy. That's the kind of joy we're dealing with. That's the kind of joy that all of us are invited into. That's the kind of joy all of us are invited to reflect, because we are here to retell a story. We are here to set the record straight. And heaven is not about sitting on a cloud and playing your harp. Nothing against harps. I love harps. We've got a harpist in the room. Heaven is not about sitting on your cloud and playing your harp. Heaven is about the wildest party you could ever imagine. That's why the angels can't stop. That's why they sing night and day. That's why, because it is the party of all parties. When you die and get to heaven, and there's all sorts of theology that's wrong about that, because we are all experiencing heaven right now. That's what heaven is. It's a coexistent reality that's breaking in now. But even in the moment when you die and you get into the fullness of the heaven, it's not going to be sweet and serene and sickly religion. It's going to be wild and free and loud and crazy, which is why we often laugh when people are offended by joy breaking out in our meetings. And Julian often says, if you're offended by joy, God bless you, you're not going to enjoy heaven very much. Heaven is going to be full of outrageous joy, because that's the nature of God. We're being introduced to a God who is not only appropriately joy-filled, but is loudly joy-filled. He is the loudest father in the room. He's the one who makes you blush externally and you roll your eyes and you're like, oh, Dad, you're so not cool. But internally you're like, he's so awesome, and makes my heart burst with pride. He's that father. And that's the reality we're being invited into. That's why the Pharisees, and you'll have heard me say this 100 times, but it's why the Pharisees hated Jesus. Because there was no sickly religion about him, and they were all about sickly religion. They were all about polite smiles. They were all about coloring within the lines because it made them feel superior to others. They were all about that. That was how they defined religion. And here comes along Jesus, who has the audacity to laugh louder than anybody else in the room and call it spiritual. Here comes Jesus, who has the audacity to preach a message about blessed be, literally ecstatically happy be my listeners. Who is this guy who thinks he has the authority to retell what religion is about, to rewrite the story of God himself? Well, hello, God himself is the one who's doing that. But they couldn't recognize him. They couldn't understand him because joy took them fully by surprise and they rejected it rather than entered into it. That's why sinners wanted to be near Jesus, not because he was this weird, not because he was religious, but because he was fun, because he was laughing, because he was genuinely happy, overflowing with joy. That's why the librarians of religion in Jesus' day hated him. He refused to be controlled by their lines and their rules, and was consistently retelling the story of the nature of God. No, he's not a strict disciplinarian. He is the life and soul of the party. That's who he is. And the beautiful thing is, and we looked at John 15 together last week, but the beauty of John 15 is that Jesus promises, I've said all of these things, his final words to them, so that my joy would be in you and your joy would be complete. Yeah. That is the invitation of Christianity. It's not following a list of rules. It's not adhering to a certain moral principles. It's coming into encounter face to face with a God who is happier than you could ever have believed. You've never met anyone as joy-filled as he is. And not only does he say, come and look upon my joy, he says, come and have my joy, so that what you have will echo what I have, and then everyone will be offended by your joy as much as they're offended by mine. That's why I'm passionate about this community. I'm passionate about this because it's time that Christians set the record straight. It's time that people in the world didn't go out there somewhere to find a grain of joy to make their miserable lives less miserable. It's time that Christians were so crammed full of joy that people understand, if I want something that is going to break off this horrible life that I'm living, is not to be found out there, it's to be found in communion with the Christian who lives next to me. Because they are happier than I've ever seen any human being be reasonably. Because your joy is unreasonable. Because it's not rooted in what's happening in your life, it's rooted in the reality of who your Father is. Third thing, the joy of Christianity is a super weapon. This is no kind of giggles of denial when you get into a laughing fit because life is so bad that you need to laugh, if not you're going to cry. So you just laugh, you give in to that because you just need to ignore the pain of your existence. This is no drug high that just takes you out from just lets you escape from what's actually happening around you, numbs that pain so that you can laugh. This is nothing like that. Jesus, who experienced joy, was a man who was acquainted with grief, we read in Isaiah. He was a man of sorrows. The thing about the joy of Jesus isn't that okay. Here's the thing about Jesus, is that he took on flesh and became fully human. Yeah. That's the beauty of the gospel, in that God could have come, as he does in so many other religions who try to explain the existence of God. He could have come as a floating, levitating deity who would just come and bestow on humanity a few sprinkles of his blessing, who could just float around untouched by any brokenness of humanity. He could have done that. He could have come in an untouchable form where he was protected by the disease and brokenness that is everywhere in the world. He could have done that, and then he could be justified for being joyful because his life was totally untouched by the reality of brokenness. But that's not the gospel. God is much kinder than that. God didn't appear as some floating deity who didn't want to be touched by our grubbiness. God moved into our neighborhood. He humbled himself, taking on flesh over his deity. He literally put aside everything that was glorious and took on the brokenness of humanity in a very real sense. He wasn't saying, ew, don't touch me, I'm too busy being happy over in my safe corner over here. He was saying, let me come in to all that is broken, all that is hopeless, all that is in despair. Let me touch it, let me feel it, let me be impacted by it, let me weep real tears over it. And then let me show you joy in the midst of that. Because the same man who was the man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, is the same man who had the oil of joy beyond his companions. He wasn't joy-filled because he was in denial. He wasn't joy-filled because he turned a blind eye to the brokenness of humanity. No, he was joy-filled because right in the midst of brokenness, that is the super weapon to walk you through. It was for the joy set before him that he was able to endure the cross. The joy of Christianity is not just surprising. It's not just loud. It's not just about partying. It is literally a super weapon in your hands so that you can sustain any process of pain, because the joy that flows from you will walk you through it. Amen. It's a super weapon. That's why the angel comes and says, "Fear not. I bring you good news of loud joy." There's a clue there. The good news of loud joy comes back to alleviate the fear. It is powerful. The joy unravels the fear. It is something so powerful, which is why Jesus wants us to have what is in him, because he understands that we're living lives that experience pain and brokenness and disease and hopelessness. But he's saying, here, come and enter into my joy. It will sustain you to walk through every moment of that. If this is why I say I don't trust intercessors who are not joy-filled.
Come on. Go there.
Because joy is power. Yeah. And if your intercession is depressed, you're not going to be seeing anything happen. Nehemiah 8 says, "The joy of the Lord is your strength." The word strength there can actually be translated as your safety. It is your stronghold. It is the source and the protector of your safety. That's the joy of the Lord. And there are so many Christians who want to intercede for things but are so depressed by them, and we almost wear our depression as a badge of honor, like I'm a really big intercessor because I've really plumbed the depth of the darkness and it's all over me. No! Happy intercession is the only kind of intercession that holds any power, because joy is strength, and when you're interceding, God knows you need strength. It's a super weapon in our hands.
Come on.
It's a super weapon in our hands. I really can't say this enough. For so many of us, we're in the midst of battles. Do you know what you do? You get happy in God. Don't do anything else before you do that. Because it was for the joy that Jesus was able to endure the cross. Without the joy, there was no enduring the cross. And there's this weird thing that's crept into Christianity, which is glorifying brokenness, glorifying sacrifice, glorifying the cross. The cross isn't glorious without the resurrection. There's nothing glorious about suffering in and of itself. It doesn't make you holy. It doesn't make you spiritual. It is not a badge of honor. You cannot walk around saying, "Look how godly I am," because of all of the suffering that I've experienced, if there isn't a miraculous resurrection on the other side of that.
Come on. That's so good.
If all you're doing is sitting in your pit of suffering and using that as a badge about your morality, you haven't understood the gospel. Because suffering is only glorious because there's a miracle attached to it. The cross is only glorious because there's the miracle of resurrection attached to it. Without that, it's just another fallen hero. The joy you have in your hands is a super weapon. And I'll have told you guys this story before, but I think it's worth retelling. When Julian and I got married, there was all sorts of problems around that. Julian's mom was in a coma. She didn't come to our wedding. You can hear me say the story from a different message, so I won't rehash the whole thing. But God taught me in that season about joy being warfare. And it was crazy, and I actually had this crazy encounter with God where I was inappropriate in the loudness of my laughter for an hour and a half in a meeting where no one else was laughing. But anyway, in that moment, God spoke to me about joy being warfare. And about a year after that, we'd got pregnant. We were overjoyed about it. Then we started miscarrying the baby. And there was all sorts of people praying for us. We were actually on a ministry trip. It was this kind of crazy scenario. We were heartbroken. We were really trying to contend for the life of this baby whilst kind of none of my symptoms changing. And we did two things in that season that brought us great power. The first thing was, and I want to encourage you this, when the devil hits you hard, get up and do something that hits him just as hard. So the next morning I got up, after miscarrying, and I preached a message about the kingdom of God. And it wasn't about denial of the pain that was happening, but I was thinking, you want to hit me? Let's preach and proclaim the reality of the kingdom of God, because there is a kingdom advancing and we will not step back or give ground. That was one thing that we did. The second thing that we did was a couple of weeks, the miscarriage was horrible and long and just a horrible time. And in the midst of brokenness, a couple of weeks later, where we were still losing this baby, and I remember God saying to me, in a really low point for me, he said, I taught you a year ago about warfare, and you're not doing what I told you to do. And I was like, joy, how on earth am I meant to find joy right now? And so, I don't know about you, but in those moments, I've got to do super practical things. These things, it's not spiritual if it's not practical. If it's all in your head, it's not going to work out. And so I wrote on a piece of paper just how horribly hopeless the moment was for us, just how much loss and heartbreak we were experiencing. And I stood on that piece of paper. I put some worship music on, and I thought, I'm going to find a way to get happy with God, and I'm not going to move until that happens. And it took me about 2 hours of worship, and then suddenly joy filled me and filled that room. And honestly, the verse that says he turns our mourning into dancing, ashes into beauty, that became real in my heart. I experienced that in a tangible way, and I knew in that moment that joy would see me through that period of time. Nothing changed in our circumstance. Our baby made it to Jesus face to face before we did. But the point is this, that joy, for the joy set before him, he endured. I want to tell you, in the midst of pain, there's only one super weapon that you need to carry, and it's the joy of God.
Come on.
That's what sustains you in the storm. That's what walks you through the storm. Last one. The joy of Christianity is for all. Good news of loud joy for all. In a world that is obsessed with political correctness and inclusiveness, which I find really ironic, because actually the inclusiveness that the world speaks about, you're only included as long as you agree with their inclusion. Anyone who disagrees with that inclusion is actually excluded, which makes no sense at all. That's not really including anyone except for the people who agree with you. But anyway, the fact that they haven't figured that out is funny to me. In a world that's obsessed with inclusion, here's a good verse. Christianity is often seen as the most exclusive thing, and yet it's in fact the most inclusive, because it's saying no matter who you are, no matter where you're from, no matter what you bring to the table, no matter how big or how small, how wealthy, how poor, how successful, how insignificant, this joy is for you. And the beautiful thing about it is that the angels go to shepherds as if to prove the point. I think that's exactly why they did it. They went to people who in society would have been seen as insignificant. They went to people who were literally the source of disappointment for their mothers. In Jewish society, what your mother hoped for you was to become a rabbi, to become a teacher of the law. The whole education system was created around that one aim, so that their sons would go to school, they'd memorize the Torah, they'd memorize the Old Testament, they'd memorize all the rabbinic teachings, and at each stage, if they did well enough, they would be able to move on to the next stage of class, and they would do that with literally this one aim in mind, to become a rabbi. The whole of Jewish society was created around that. So if you were a shepherd, guess what? You'd flunked out of school. You were the one who really did bring a source of disappointment to your mother's heart. You were doing exactly what your mom hoped you would never do. And the shepherds go to them. They say, hey, listen up. We've got good news of loud joy, and it's for all, which is why we're telling you. I want to tell you, this gospel of joy has got nothing to do with what you think you bring. It's got everything to do with the extravagant generosity of the heart of God. That's why we're here, isn't it? With all our different stories, with all our different backgrounds, understanding that God has been kinder to us than we've we deserved. And this is why, again, it's crucial for us to set the record straight, for us to retell the story. Because out there, people think, Christians believe they have some level of moral superiority. That's why they got into the club. That couldn't be further from the truth. We're the people saying we didn't have it together, and yet God is kind, and God is kind to all.
Yeah.
And so here we have it. The angels announce something that I believe is something for us to take hold of, to allow to become a part of the deepest parts of our belief systems, and then to overflow from us.
Yeah.
A joy that's surprising, a joy that is inappropriately loud, a joy that's a super weapon, and a joy that is for all. Why don't you stand with me for a minute? We're just gonna